Don Haskins and Adolph Rupp put together two of the best college basketball teams of the 20th century in 1966, in the middle of the racial divide in America that caused so much pain for so many people for many, many years. These coaches created their teams in two completely opposite ways, and it has been said that they have two different. Their teams were created almost with two different worldviews that were in America in that time. On the one side, you have Adolph Rupp that had an offensive-minded, running gun, conventional team that was primarily a white team, and the other was a defensive-minded, pound you into the ground with the defense, unconventional team that had the first all black starting five in a national championship game. Uh, were they really so different as coaches? It has been said that they have the same personalities or they ran their things somewhat in the same way. So I'm just gonna in this speech I'm going to talk about the differences and somewhat the similarities between these two coaches. So Adolph Rupp Kentucky team was always the class of college basketball, with his mostly white teams that prided themselves on being able to outrun and outscore anybody in the nation. His practices really consisted of like going over the same 6 to 7 drills as it was described in my book, The Baron and the Bear. And each time, all he would do was just have a slight different variation of the plays, and they would often run their 2 to 3 hour practices with practicing almost no defense and just practicing his plays over and over again. The teams that played them during the season would try getting into Rupp's head, trying to tell him that they're going to change up their defenses. They ran man-to-man defenses, 2 to 3 zones, 1-3-1 zones, full court press, half-court presses, all throughout the season, just different things, trying to screw with different guys' heads. But there was only one team that could actually defeat the Kentucky Wildcats during this season, and it was the Tennessee Volunteers. And the Volunteers didn't even necessarily shut down their offense. They were a team where, because there was no shot clock, they really held the ball for as long as they can, and they really disrupted the rhythm of the Kentucky team. But also, right before this game started, they were told that the Vanderbilt Commodores lost their regular season game, which gave them the SEC championship, which allowed them to be in the championship, or which allowed them to be in the NCAA tournament no matter what. So a little bit of the burden came off their shoulders, and they played a little unconventional in that game. Other than that, throughout the season, they really were not shut down by another team until they got to the championship game. The other difference that could be pointed out between Kentucky and Texas Western would be the pedigree of the two schools. Adolph Rupp could come into a player's house and make some great points about how he's won 4 national championships before this season. They have a great program that has, throughout the years, been one of the best at winning games and being able to be at a championship level every year. They're in a big tournament they're in a big conference with quite a bit of other teams that NBA scouts come and see, and they have a lot of exposure to NBA scouts, so that also helps. And when you learn from the man that learned from the person that created the game of basketball, like that gives you another little tidbit you can throw in there to recruits that gets them to want to come and be a Kentucky Wildcat. And all the tradition and pedigree that went with Kentucky basketball and Adolph Rupp was hard to match. And Don Haskins really didn't try to embrace this, and he really went against the grain and really was unconventional in the things that he wanted to do. Don Haskins coached his team in a less conventional, more blue-collar way than Adolph Rupp coached his team. And though it was almost the opposite of the way that things were run during these days, he still had success during this 1966 season, and that most coaches in that time could only dream of. His team was built on the defensive side of the ball. He made sure that every kid in his program knew exactly how to run every one of his defenses. Like Rupp at Kentucky running all offense during practices, Haskins' practices consisted of defense, defense, defense. It was figuring out almost the exact opposite. It was just running your defensive plays over and over so they could run variations of things depending on what the offense that they were facing was doing. Offense was almost an afterthought during these practices. Compared to a rep practice, it seemed like this was almost childish. It was described as almost like junior high school drills that they would do during their practices. They would do the things such as the three-man weave, and pick and roll drills that a lot of high schoolers have already got pretty much down. But you know what? They just ran that over and over. But if nobody could score on this team, then they didn't really have to score very much as they needed to. So the history of basketball at Texas Western also wasn't exactly one that you would expect would produce a championship. But with a great head coach running the team how he wanted to, and all the players thought were the best fit, he proved that you can do anything with the cards that you are dealt. So down in Texas, it was a lot harder to try to recruit kids to come down to his little school in El Paso with nothing to do and not playing in the biggest conference or playing against the best competition every year. So he had to really make a point of going out and recruiting whoever wanted to come. White, black, it didn't matter what players wanted to come. If they wanted to come and play, he would get them on the team. And so, although there were a lot of differences, there were also some similarities between the two. The practices between the two schools could be described as pretty similar. Like, the coaches demanded that there was no talking during any of the practices for both teams, and they only practiced one side of the ball for as long as they possibly could. And you could also say that during their practices or during their seasons, that the players you could see that they demanded, or the coaches demanded, respect from their players and made sure that they knew that they were in charge no matter what. So to conclude, Adolph Rolf was more of the offensive-minded, high-profile coach at his school with a rich history of college basketball success for the most part with his all-white teams. Don Haskins at Texas Western was more of a defensive-minded, unconventional team that had the first starting five in the championship game history, with all five being black. These two coaches can both be considered all-time greats with histories of winning, but there are more differences between the two coaches than there are similarities.